You ever feel like you need a law degree just to do your grocery shopping? Well, today we're going to try and demystify some of the most confusing words in the entire supermarket, the ones right there on our food labels.
You know the feeling, right? You're standing in the aisle staring at two boxes of crackers. One is screaming, all natural. The other says, no preservatives, and you're just left there wondering, what's the real difference here? It feels like you need a chemistry degree just to figure out what to have for lunch.
First, you're hit with a term like highly processed. And then you see something that sounds even more complex, like reconstituted.
And then there's a label that sounds amazing, right? No preservatives. They all sound super important, but what do they actually mean when the lawyers get involved?
Or here's the big twist. It turns out that in the eyes of the law, and we're talking specifically about EU food law here, most of those buzzwords you've been trying so hard to decode, they don't have any legal meaning at all.
So today, we are going to cut right through all that noise. We'll kick things off with the buzzwords, and then we'll get into the two legal realities that actually matter. We'll look at the specific rules for additives, explore those unofficial scientific categories, and finally, try to understand why this huge gap between marketing and law even exists in the first place.
All right, let's dive into the first big reveal, how EU law actually sees the food on your plate. And I'll give you a spoiler, it is way, way simpler than you think.
So on the left, you've got the total chaos of marketing jargon that we get bombarded with every single day. But look over on the right. That's the world according to EU law. It just simplifies everything down into two and only two fundamental categories, unprocessed and processed. That's it. So what does unprocessed actually mean in a legal sense? Well, the law defines it as food that hasn't gone through some kind of chemical or biological transformation. Think about physical actions, cutting something up, freezing it, or trimming it. This means that things like fresh apples, raw meat, eggs, and even pasteurized milk all fall under this unprocessed umbrella. The basic structure of the food is still there.
And that brings us to the only other legal category that exists, processed. This is basically anything where the original food has been substantially altered. The law gives examples like heating, smoking, curing, or drying. So, and this is the really crucial point, everyday things we all eat, like a simple loaf of bread, a block of cheese, or a pot of yogurt, they all fall squarely into this legal processed category.
Okay, so you're probably wondering, where do all those E-numbers and preservatives fit into all this? Well, what's really interesting is that EU law doesn't create a whole new class of food for them. Instead, it just treats additives as having a regulated status.
And the rules for that status? They are incredibly strict. An additive is only allowed if it can pass 4 big tests. First, it has to be on the pre-approved list. Second, it can only be used in very specific categories of food. Third, its maximum level has been rigorously assessed for safety. And finally, it absolutely must have a clear technological purpose, like preserving the food or improving its texture.
So if the law is so simple, just processed and unprocessed, then where in the world do all these other terms, especially ultra-processed, even come from? Well, this is where the world of science and the world of marketing crash into the picture.
You see, public health scientists actually use a much more detailed system to classify food processing. This chart here shows that whole spectrum, all the way from unprocessed raw foods over to things like vegan meats, which are literally built from isolated components. And this is where that term ultra-processed comes from. It's a scientific category for industrial formulations.
Okay, now this is probably the single most important takeaway from this whole explainer. The terms you hear all the time, ultra-processed, highly processed, and especially clean label, are not legal categories in the European Union. They come from science, they come from marketing, but they hold exactly zero official weight in food regulation.
Let's take clean label for a second. This is a pure marketing category. A product might say no preservatives on the front, but then use something like citrus acid or rosemary extract in the ingredients. Well, guess what? Those ingredients perform the exact same chemical function as a named preservative, but they just sound a lot more natural to you and me. The chemistry is identical, it's only the perception that's different.
So this brings us to the final big question. Why? Why is there such a massive gap between the language the law uses, the language scientists use, and the labels we see on our food? Well, it all comes down to a really fundamental difference in focus.
This quote really gets right to the heart of the matter. EU food law is toxicologically and technologically oriented. What does that mean? It means it's designed to answer two pretty simple questions. Is this one specific substance toxic? And does it have a good technological reason to be in the food? It is not systems biology oriented, which means it's just not designed to look at the bigger picture of how that food interacts with our bodies as a whole system.
So what does this mean in practice? It means safety gets assessed one additive at a time, not based on how an entire dietary pattern affects you. The focus is purely on toxicology, not on more modern concepts like our gut health or the microbiome. The law regulates what's allowed in a product, not how that highly engineered product might interact with your body's complex systems.
Let me put it as plainly as I possibly can. That term we hear everywhere, ultra-processed, appears in EU food safety regulations exactly 0 times. Not once. It remains a concept from the world of nutritional science completely outside the legal framework.
And that leaves us with this really fascinating tension, doesn't it? On one hand, you have regulation, which is focused on safety, one ingredient at a time. And on the other hand, you have science, which is trying to explore the incredibly complex ways our bodies interact with entire food systems. So the big question for all of us is, should that gap be closed? And what would it even look like if our laws started to think not just about what's in our food, but what our food is actually doing to us? Now that is something to chew on.